Hello everyone, today we will step into the golden halls of Babylon, where power flows like wine and fate changes with a single sip. Imagine this: Alexander the Great, the man who brought empires to their knees, standing tall beneath flickering torchlight, his bronze skin glowing with sweat, his voice booming with victory. He lifts a cup in celebration, unaware that in that very moment, he is already dying. Before we get started on this story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And when we reach the end, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Was this the inevitable end of a legend, or the perfect assassination? The feast had begun like so many before, opulent, chaotic, endless. The palace in Babylon echoed with laughter, metal clinking on stone, and the warm slosh of overflowing goblets. This was not just a gathering, it was a celebration of power, of dominance, of a world carved beneath one man's sword. Alexander was 32, in the prime of his brilliance, and he sat at the head of it all like a god among mortals. On this night, he was celebrating the completion of plans to invade Arabia. The map of the known world had already bowed to him, but Alexander's hunger for conquest was bottomless. Those in his company, generals, governors, satraps, even Persian nobles, knew better than to question it. Their glasses were full, their eyes locked on their king. And then, someone offered him a cup. It was no ordinary goblet. It came from a trusted officer, Midas of Larissa, who poured the wine himself. A strong Macedonian vintage, chilled and rich. Alexander accepted it with a smile, lifting it high for all to see. He made a toast to the gods, to glory, to empire. And then he drank. The moment passed without fanfare. The music resumed. The dancers spun. But somewhere in the shadows of that hall, history held its breath. Later that night, Alexander felt a pain, not sharp, but deep. A strange twist in his gut. He dismissed it. He was no stranger to injury or discomfort. Campaigning across deserts and mountains had hardened him to suffering. He slept without complaint, assuming it would pass. It didn't. By morning, the pain had intensified. He rose from his bed, pale and sweating. His hands shook. He waved away his attendants, insisting it was nothing. His pride would not allow him to show weakness, not to his army, not to his court, not to the world. But the court noticed. At breakfast, he barely touched his food. At the command meeting, he excused himself early. When he returned to his quarters, he collapsed into his chair and stared at the wall, silent. That evening, he tried to appear at another feast. This time, his steps were slower. His eyes lacked fire. He managed a single toast before quietly leaving the room, supported by two of his guards. Behind him, whispers began. Was it fever? Was it exhaustion? Or something far worse? The physicians were summoned. They took his pulse, felt his forehead, examined his eyes. But nothing they did brought relief. They prescribed rest, tonics, herbs, and hot compresses, but none could explain the pain that seemed to bloom from within him, coiling tighter by the hour. And still, Alexander said nothing of the cup. He didn't suspect. Not yet. Because the greatest warriors rarely imagine they can be undone from the inside. By the second day, the pain no longer whispered, it roared. Alexander could no longer stand without help. His commanders entered his chambers to find the conqueror of Persia seated on the edge of his bed, face drawn, his usually sun-golden skin now waxen and damp. He greeted them with the remnants of a smile, but his eyes betrayed him. They were dim, unfocused. And yet not once did he speak of fear. The physicians continued their treatments. They applied compresses, offered wine diluted with crushed herbs, performed prayers in both Greek and Babylonian tongues. Some even ventured into occult remedies, hoping the gods or spirits might intervene. But nothing worked. And outside the palace walls, the city of Babylon stirred. It was said that the birds had flown oddly that week, circling in patterns above the Euphrates, screaming as if mourning. A strange quiet fell over the marketplaces. Merchants set out fewer wares. Mothers pulled their children closer. Something in the wind felt wrong. Even the dogs seemed to bark more at night. Inside the palace, the fear thickened. On the third day, Alexander attempted to walk to the courtyard. He made it 5 steps before collapsing. His body burned with fever now, a wet, invisible flame coursing through him. He gritted his teeth, still refusing to scream. The man who had stared down elephants, sieges, and the snows of the Hindu Kush would not cry out. But his silence was no longer mistaken for strength. His generals began to worry. Not just for their king, but for the succession. He had not named an heir. His son by Roxana was unborn. His half-brother Aridaeus was considered unfit. The men who had once bled beside him on the battlefield now stood at the foot of his bed, calculating what came next, not in weeks or months, but in days. And Alexander knew. Lying there, drenched in sweat, he could feel the change. Not just in his body, but in the air around him. The way his trusted commanders averted their eyes. The way his cupbearer trembled when pouring water. The way no one spoke his name in the hallways. He had become a ghost among the living. And the pain, oh, the pain! It was unlike anything he had ever known. It didn't spike and fade like battle wounds. It crept. It gnawed. It hollowed. There were moments when he felt as if his stomach were boiling. Other times, he grew cold and shivered uncontrollably, even beneath heavy linen. There was no wound to dress. No enemy to strike. Just an unseen tormentor, working from within. On the 5th day, he lost the ability to speak clearly. His words slurred. He tried to call for Hephaestion, forgetting, in his delirium, that his closest companion had died months earlier. He asked for his mother, Olympias. Then for his childhood horse, Bucephalus. Only silence answered him. The physicians, now panicked, tried everything. Bloodletting. Emesis. Incense burned until the chamber stank of ash. But the fever would not break. And worse, his abdomen had begun to swell. His breath came shallow. His hands twitched in sleep. And yet he lived. Day after day, the king endured. He faded, inch by inch, yet refused to die. The court began to murmur, was this a curse? A punishment from the gods? Or perhaps the work of man? Because among the generals, a theory was rising. One that few dared speak aloud. Poison. Slow. Meticulous. Administered not in a single goblet, but drop by drop, over days. Disguised in wine or food, perhaps from the very hands of those he trusted most. The nature of the illness, its delayed onset, its cruelty without visible wound, whispered of something unnatural. But who would dare? And why now? Some pointed to Antipater, left behind in Macedon with old grudges and a hunger for power. Others to Cassander or Ptolemy. Or even Roxana herself, desperate to protect her unborn son's place in a kingdom that no longer had rules. But suspicion alone meant nothing. The only man who could answer was Alexander. And Alexander, now, barely had the strength to breathe. As night fell on the 7th day, the palace grew silent. The music stopped. The feasting ceased. And in the stillness, Alexander lay awake, eyes open, staring at the stars through a lattice of carved stone. He did not sleep. He simply waited. For what, none could say. By the 8th day, Alexander could no longer move his limbs. The conqueror of the known world, who had crossed deserts and mountains, who had tamed the wildest cavalry and stood undefeated in battle, was now a prisoner within his own skin. His muscles no longer obeyed him. His voice, once loud enough to command armies, had thinned into a breathless whisper. Even blinking felt deliberate, as if his body now rationed motion the way dying kingdoms ration grain. He was aware. Terribly aware. He could hear them when they thought he slept, his generals, huddled beyond the curtain, speaking in hushed tones. Gone was the unity forged through years of warfare. In its place, suspicion festered. Each man eyed the others not as brothers in arms, but as rivals for a throne still warm. "Who will lead when he dies?" one murmured. "Does he still breathe?" another asked. "Has he chosen an heir?" And beneath it all, the question none dared voice aloud: who helped him fall? Alexander lay still, his body drenched in sweat that chilled even in the Babylonian heat. He longed to speak, to command, to warn, but the weight on his chest was too great. His tongue felt like stone. All he could do was listen. He had seen betrayal before. Kingdoms turning on themselves the moment their ruler blinked. But this was something darker. It wasn't just that power was slipping away. It was being carved away, quietly, by hands once sworn to serve him. Outside the palace, the city seemed to hold its breath. Babylon, cosmopolitan, wild, ever watchful, knew what happened when empires cracked. Merchants slowed their trade. Messengers left the city under cover of darkness, bearing letters to distant governors and warlords. The lions in the palace zoo went silent. On the 9th day, the generals entered the room again, this time in a line, stiff-backed, armored not for battle but for ceremony. They stood at his bedside and demanded something unthinkable. They wanted to speak to him. They wanted him to name the heir. A torch flickered against the marble walls, casting long shadows over Alexander's motionless frame. His eyes opened barely. He blinked once. "Who?" one asked, stepping closer. Alexander struggled. His lips moved. No sound emerged. A second general leaned in. "Say it. Who inherits the empire?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, one breath, rough and wet, like stone dragged over sand. "To the strongest." The words came out ragged, uncertain. Maybe they were real. Maybe the generals only heard what they wanted. But it was enough. That night, they began dividing the empire. Not by order. Not by law. But by proximity to power. Ptolemy began securing Egypt. Seleucus eyed the east. Perdiccas whispered about taking the regency. Others plotted in darker corners, blades never far from reach. Meanwhile, Alexander slipped further. He could no longer eat. His attendants spooned honey into his mouth, most of which ran down his chin. He coughed constantly, his chest rattling like a dying engine. His eyes grew yellowed, glazed. His breath, when it came, was slow and labored. But he watched. That was the terrible part. Even in his helplessness, Alexander watched. His gaze followed the men who walked into his chamber. He saw who avoided looking at him, who hesitated, who wept, and who didn't. He saw fear. He saw greed. And he saw the seeds of the empire's unraveling taking root, watered not by tears, but by ambition. In the night, a storm rolled over Babylon. Wind howled through the narrow windows. Sand coated the marble halls. A bolt of lightning split the sky in two. The priests took it as omen. Some whispered that the gods had come to collect the soul of the man who had dared to call himself divine. But the gods would have to wait. Because Alexander the Great, even on the edge of death, clung to life with a will forged in fire. He endured another day. And another. Trapped. Voiceless. Burning. His empire had taken the world. Now it was taking him. The 10th day dawned with no sun, only haze. Dust from the previous night's storm clung to the window slats, veiling the chambers of the palace in a muted gloom. In Alexander's bedchamber, time no longer moved in minutes or hours. It moved in breaths, slow, irregular, each one possibly his last. By now, no one doubted he was dying. The physicians had stopped pretending. Their tools lay untouched. The herbal remedies, once brewed and fussed over, sat cooling in shallow basins. Some had quietly left the palace. Others lingered outside the door, unwilling to watch the final unraveling. Inside, the generals had begun rotating their vigil. They stood over the man who once stood over the world, staring into the hollowed shell he had become. Some came to mourn. Some to measure. Some to make certain he would not speak again. Alexander's eyes no longer tracked movement. His skin had lost its heat, but not entirely. His hands twitched at times, as if chasing the memory of a sword long since put down. His mouth was slightly open, but no words came. Only a rattling sound, a rattle known to every soldier on every battlefield. But still, he did not die. Even now, as his body betrayed him, Alexander refused surrender. His will, so often called divine, anchored him in a realm between life and whatever came after. He was neither gone nor present. He lingered. And while he lingered, the empire moved on without him. The royal court descended into quiet chaos. Messengers slipped in and out at all hours. Maps were unfurled, then quickly rolled away at the sound of approaching footsteps. The word partition was uttered more frequently now, never in Alexander's hearing, but always in his shadow. In a nearby room, Roxana wept, not only for her husband, but for her unborn child. She knew what kind of world awaited a fatherless heir. And she knew the men who now circled the throne were not the same ones who had followed Alexander across continents. These were men sharpened by politics, not war. Men who measured destiny in territories and troop counts, not vision. But Alexander, for all his silence, gave no sign that he would name another successor. He had said what he said, to the strongest. A challenge. A curse. Perhaps both. On the 12th day, his body entered its final stage. He could no longer swallow. His breathing became shallower. His abdomen, swollen and hard, looked unnatural, tight as a drum, as if something inside were trying to escape. His lips cracked. His skin turned gray in places. The heat had left him. And then something changed. Late in the evening, as twilight kissed the edge of the palace walls, Alexander opened his eyes fully for the first time in days. He blinked once, slowly, and then he raised his right hand. The generals were summoned. They filed in, one by one, standing in formation like soldiers before a king. Their armor gleamed. Their faces were pale. No one spoke. Even the sound of their footsteps was muted, as if the walls themselves understood that this was not a moment for noise. Alexander looked at them. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But he saw. He saw Seleucus, standing stiffly with fists clenched. Ptolemy, eyes narrowed with calculation. Perdiccas, arms crossed but breathing hard. Antigonus. Lysimachus. Eumenes. Men who had once followed him without question, now waiting for a kingdom to divide. And then, he lowered his hand. Just once. It was not a wave. Not a farewell. It was permission. They took it as a signal. Whether it was or not, none could say. But it was enough. The generals turned and left, one by one. And Alexander closed his eyes again. Outside, the torches burned lower. Inside, silence wrapped the room like gauze. No fanfare. No priestly chanting. Just breath. And the question that hung heavier than gold in the air. Was this the end of a man, or the beginning of a legend too vast to die? Morning arrived with no declaration, no divine trumpet blast from Olympus. Just the gray hush of another Babylonian dawn, soft and indifferent. The palace servants moved with reverent caution, speaking only in whispers. No one had the courage to ask aloud, "Is he still alive?" Because deep down, they already knew. Alexander the Great, the man who'd crossed the deserts of Egypt, stood unbroken at Gaugamela, and watched Persepolis burn, was now completely still. No breath. No twitch of the eyes. No weight on the air. Even the fever that had clung to him like an unseen parasite had vanished. What remained on the bed was not a god-king, nor a conqueror, but simply a body. Frail. Mortal. Cold. They found him just before the hour of sunrise, his head tilted slightly to the right, his hands resting on his chest. Eyes closed. Lips slightly parted. There was no sign of pain. If anything, it looked as though he had drifted away mid-thought, still scheming, still planning his next campaign, across seas he'd never reach. A death without a last word. A kingdom without a final command. Word of his passing spread like wildfire. Across the palace first, whispers turned to gasps, and gasps turned to arguments. Within hours, the streets of Babylon were a thrum of chaos. Merchants halted their sails. The temple bells rang with a confusion they weren't built for. There was no precedent for this, not the death of a king, but this king. Alexander hadn't just ruled the world, he had redrawn it in his image. And now that image had begun to blur. The body was not buried, not at first. The generals, too divided to agree on a successor, could not agree on a tomb. Some argued he should return to Macedon. Others to Egypt. Still others claimed he had instructed to be interred in the very city he had last conquered. While they debated, they had him embalmed, wrapped in linen, coated in precious oils, sealed in a golden sarcophagus shaped like a warrior's armor. But even his body would not rest easily. As weeks turned to months, and the empire began to crack, the sarcophagus was stolen. Smuggled out by Ptolemy, taken to Memphis, then to Alexandria. And still, no tomb bore the words, "Alexander lies here." His grave became a symbol of what he left behind, a world fractured by ambition, stitched together only by legend. Back in Babylon, the court was tearing itself apart. Roxana, pregnant and guarded by her loyalists, retreated into isolation. Within a year, both she and her child would be murdered, another fire smothered before it could burn. The generals turned against each other. The wars of the Diadochi would rage for decades, scattering Alexander's dream into pieces like shattered marble. But despite the blood, despite the betrayals, despite the centuries of rewriting and retelling, one thing endured. His death. Not just that he died, but how. Whispers of poison persisted long after his body cooled. Some claimed it was slow-acting hemlock. Others blamed a corrupted wine, laced with toxins from far-off lands. Still others, divine punishment, for calling himself the son of Zeus, for burning sacred cities, for daring to believe he could conquer death. But no matter the theory, the effect was the same. Alexander had been felled, not by spear, nor by sword, nor by siege, but by something far more intimate. A betrayal that bypassed walls and armies. A quiet assassination dressed as illness. And what made it truly terrifying was not the act itself, but the timing. Because if it was murder, it was done with precision. Planned. Executed slowly. Silently. So perfectly that even now, over 2,000 years later, we're still not certain. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest legacy of all. A man who wanted to be immortal left the world in the most human way possible, alone, in pain, and unsure who would carry on his name. His final empire was not one of land or gold, but of uncertainty. Of rumor. Of shadow. And maybe that's why he remains. In history books. In dreams. In every tale of kings who rise too high. Because Alexander didn't just build cities or win battles, he haunts the idea of power itself. A reminder that no matter how vast the empire, or how fierce the army, even the greatest of us can be unmade by something as small as a sip from the wrong cup.